You have to believe me, the guys you saw on this picture at the beginning are just plain and normal guys. Of course, they're no fools. They're not robots. They know emotions, they know fear, but they just have learned to manage their emotions. When you're being sent in a hostile territory in the middle of the night, minus 50 degrees C outside, because you're flying at 9,000 feet, you've got 50 kilos of equipment on your body, which make your flying attitude very difficult. You know that if you there are lots of turbulences, so your parachute may twist, and you don't really know how to assess the situation, the position of the enemy on the ground. You're scared of getting lost. So when a guy tells you, I'm not scared, this guy is the one that we won't send out, because it's not normal not to be scared. These guys, the ones you saw on this picture, the ones with the helmets, are all scared, because scare or fear is something that is important to be more vigilant, and it doesn't annihilate your decision capacities. These guys weep, cry, shout, complain, just as you. They're exactly the same guys as the ones that you have in your teams. And I can tell you that they perhaps have different reasons for joining this kind of business rather than working with you, but they could also actually be working with you. And you may have some of them in your groups, and you don't even know. I happen to have guys in my teams without knowing that they did that before, who had done that before. And in fact, the difference between these teams and some companies is that you do your best to make sure that managers create a collective performance of the team. Union being synonymous to force, they will be stronger in case of bad situations. So this parallel between the special forces and the world of the company is interesting, because you have to take into account the human dimension in their performance, as well as in their abilities to reinforce their confidence, but also their trust in others. It's a mix of trust and confidence that creates audacity, and it's a mix between training and experience that creates agility. I like the word agility, and it is something I talk quite a lot about. I've been a consultant for the past 2 years now, and this is something I talk about with my customers. And I can tell you that there is a real bonus in being agile. You have to be agile, because things are changing ever so fast now. So you have to be more flexible than ever, and to be flexible, you have to decentralize the decision-making processes and shorten and decentralize the decision-making processes. This is just the country of the white cappies, where everything is centralized. You also want to simplify the flow of information. In these teams, guys have just a simple brain, and as they have to deal with a high degree of complexity, we try to keep it simple. So the messages that are being sent out are split into different periods of time, because you cannot run 30 operations altogether. You can't be efficient in so doing. But if you sequence your operations, and if you organize your teams following this sequence, it makes things much more simple, and it works. And the last key to being agile and flexible is to speed the decision process. I sometimes see customers of mine making the right decision, but when the time it takes for them to take this decision, to make this decision, is too long. It's too late when it comes to their decision. They have lost their leading edge.
Okay, so what I propose now is to draw some lessons from this experience. We could perhaps share 3 keys that I've drawn from this experience, 3 keys to reinforce the agility and performance of your teams, 3 keys which are not to be taken as the only truth, but keys to help you if you need them. Okay? Now, the first key that I propose to share with you this morning is not losing sight of the challenge and the end goal of your assignment, which is what we call EFR, final effect researched in French, or ultimate result wanted, translated into English. Let me give you an example of this. On the 3rd of November 2001, this is actually my birthday as it happens, I was sent to Afghanistan with the first contingent of French forces, and France didn't recognize that they had French soldiers on the ground at that point. They said that they'd participated in the airstrikes, but they wouldn't admit that they had forces on the ground, which they did admit later. And my contingent was the first French contingent beside the American forces and the alliance for several months at more than 7,000 kilometers from senior management. And a few weeks after we'd been sent there, after a very hard fighting day, we just escaped from a trap which closed in 30 Afghan soldiers from the Northern Alliance, beside whom we were fighting. And amongst these fighters, there was Hamid. This was the General Hatta's faction, Massoud's faction, Massoud having been killed just before the 11th of September. And General Hatta then took over at the head of the army. And for several weeks, we fought with these soldiers, mainly on operations beside this particular faction of the Northern Alliance. Hamid is somebody we knew and we liked him. He was a great guy with a sense of humor. And above all, because when we got there to start with, when we were sent into the theatre of operations, we had fighting rations for some time. Then we had nothing, and we didn't get anything from the Americans either. So we lived with that faction, and we shared their food. And for several weeks, we lived with them. We lived with just a piece of bread and some rice and tea for our daily rations. And for the first time, a few weeks earlier, we were on a bivouac in there, just beside Hamid's house. And he offered us our first meat meal, which was a méchoui, grilled lamb. And early in the morning, when we were leaving the village, we found that he got his son to kill the only goat they had. And that was the goat that gave the milk to feed his youngest children. So you can see that in this country of contrast, where there's a strong tradition of hospitality, as in most of the Muslim countries, Hamid wanted to show us in his way that he was grateful for us fighting with him, beside him, against the Taliban. And a few weeks later, for several days, we were trying to take the rock in which they were imprisoned, and at midnight on the third day, ours was the very first contingent to get to the position, but in actual fact the first ones, although there was very little danger because the surviving Taliban had fled and taken refuge in a grotto, only a cave a few meters away. And when we got there, the 30 fighters had their throats slit. And I sent my report back to France, and I was just going to get into bed, and when all of a sudden I saw all the guys in the commando come along, and they said, "We want to talk to you." I didn't know what they wanted to say, but I could feel that there was something that was going to happen, so I prepared some coffee, and I got there a quarter of an hour later. And when I got there, they announced that they had decided to take revenge for Hamid, saying, You know what the Afghan friends are like. They're not very good at tactical warfare. They haven't got any technology for nighttime vision. And we're going to try and have to try and do something for them. We're trained, we've got the instruments to do this, and we owe it to them for the memory of Hamid and their family, and his family. So we're going to go and clean up the area and take revenge for them. To make the atmosphere a little more serene, if I just said no, I can tell you they would not exactly covered me with tar and feathers. But I still said no, and I said why I couldn't do this, because I felt obliged to support them, because there was a little voice saying to me this would only be justice, but I couldn't do it all the same. So I talked about ethics. I told them that the head was the guardian of our values, and that it was up to him to say how far we could go, that I'd had to face issues of corruption, not internal corruptions, but people from the state in some countries who'd asked for things which were corruption, and I couldn't allow them to take responsibility to decide on these subjects which were too sensitive. It's up to the head of the company or the head of each of the business units to give a clear boundary and set the rules of ethics in agreements with the overall policy of the organization, of course. But on the contrary to the American films, you don't. You've got to use hunters to hunt wolves, and that we were also the ambassadors of the democratic countries, and we were in charge of defending these values, even 7,000 kilometers away from home. And I talked about the Angol and the challenge of our assignment, and I remembered my school, and one of the theorists is Klaus von Clausewitz. I think he was Prussian, and he wrote huge books on the war at the end of the 18th century and other very, very relevant things. And he wrote on the issue of the Angol. For Clausewitz, war was pursuing a policy, but by other means. So he considered that war was just a means to serve a politics, but a means, not an end in itself. So what did he discover when he'd analyzed the previous wars? Well, he discovered that in warfare, the end goal very often escapes from the end goal of war. It loses sight of the challenge that war is supposed to be fighting by creating a negative spiral, which is often quite opposite the end goal that is sought. Imagine in the 18th century, the big wars, you're invading a country because you want to get its wealth for your own. Obviously, the objective there is to maintain that country in a stable economic situation to be able to take advantage of that wealth. But if the negative spiral of war is going to make you have to burn the country down to get it, then it's going to cancel out the end goal. And he also noticed that there was very often this divergence that occurred during warfare. So at this occasion, I reminded my guys of what had happened in Somalia. There was a humanitarian operation with the Americans. You might have seen the film La chute du Faucon Noir. It was an episode during which the image of US soldiers dragged around by Somalian trucks had gone all around the world, and the Americans couldn't understand that their boys, their GIs, had been treated in this way. They'd been off there for a humanitarian operation, and they immediately took all the American forces out. And I reminded my team that at the same time we were playing cat and mouse with two French reporters, and the Americans said, well, be careful, they've gone across the Kunduz Pass, or they're in Dalakan, they're Bazar Sharif, and so on. It was a sort of cat and mouse game we were playing with them. And I reminded my teams what might happen if, as in the 90s, our bodies were being dragged around behind Taliban trucks, and that the whole world would know thanks to Al Jazeera. So we had to make sure that everybody thought that we were only participating in the airstrikes, and there were no actual French soldiers on the ground. Now, why am I telling you this story? Well, because in companies too, we very often have to face accelerations, and sometimes you've got a sort of ongoing acceleration of the situation, which means that you're going to be so close to the grindstone that you don't see what's going on. And if you're not careful, you may take decisions which are going to go against the final goal that you were seeking originally. At Monoprix one day, one of my staff, and we were working on a very big project there, that was going sorely awry. People were sending in emails in the night at 2 in the morning, and I told people, no, you sleep at night, you stop sending emails, because when we get in the morning, we've got 40 emails to look, and we don't know what's gone on in the night. So I set up a meeting every morning, and I said, at night you sleep, and every morning we take stock of the situation to see what's happened. But everybody does that all together, because otherwise there'll be so many disturbances that everything's going to be totally inefficient. The situation really was going awry there. And one of the staff came in one day and said, Olivier, we've got to make this decision right away, otherwise we're dead. I said, well, we're going to die within the minute, or have we got time to discuss things first? So we sat down, I asked him some questions, I asked him what he wanted to do and what for. And I could see that the goal was not very clear in his mind. So I said, well, tell me exactly what you're thinking of. You must have a goal. And he told me exactly what the goal was, and he asked me to make the decision for him. And I said, well, now, remind me, in this sequence of the project, what is the URW, the ultimate result wanted? Well, he couldn't remember. So I said, well, it doesn't matter, turn around, and we stick things up on the wall. And each project has a clear goal at the top of the board so that everybody can see it. And above the goal, we always have the URW, which is, at the end of the project, what is this project supposed to have done? How are we going to have influenced the environment? And a goal is something that you can measure. That's the difference between the two. When the Americans invaded Iraq, the goal, I'm not talking about the fallacious objective arms of mass destruction, because everybody knew that there weren't any. George W. Bush's real goal was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. It was his personal war. That's what he wanted to do. Did he reach that goal or not? Well, yes, absolutely. But I don't know what the end goal really was. I didn't actually meet with George W. Bush, so I don't know. But if the end goal had been to maintain the stability of the country and the safety of the region, well, in that case, what a mess. And I'm not very sure that every GI from Alabama or Oklahoma knew what the final URW was. What a shame, because the end goal makes the war make sense. It's the why, and that's the driving force for any individual. But in addition to that, the end goal is going to give you a clear indication on how you're going to reach a measurable goal. As I was saying earlier, you practice the burnt earth policy otherwise. And if you're protecting the country's wealth, you don't want to do that. The end goal is going to give you indications which enables you to know what is the best and most suitable way of reaching that measurable goal. Is that clear? So very often in companies too, I don't know if you've ever seen this happen, but it does happen that in emergency situations, because to end on the previous example of Monoprix, I said to the guy, well, what is the goal? What is the URW? And he looked at it and he said, well, now tell me how that goal that you want to achieve and the decision that you're going to make is going to enable us to facilitate the URW, because if it's the case, we'll see whether the means are worth it and what means we can use. And when I asked him that, he stopped a minute and he said, oh, if we do that, we're dead. So I sort of understood that with him, you were dead whatever you did. Anyway, he never forgot. He became aware at that very moment that in an emergency situation, if your nose is too close to the grindstone, the decision might go against the URW. At the end of the project, we wanted a result on that terrain, and that would not have helped us to obtain it. So when you're talking to your teams on all levels, everybody has to know what the URW is. That's what we do in these units. We emphasize the goal of the assignment, but also we emphasize the spirit of the mission, the end goal, the boundaries, and what we're seeking to do. And whether you're talking about the mission statement of a company or a little project, everybody has to have clearly in their mind the different levels and the goals and the ultimate goal to avoid that a short-term decision may imperil the long and medium-term URWs.